Okay, so welcome to the 37th session of Examine Lives. Today's topic is family conflict, focused on Robert Trivers' parent-offspring conflict theory from 1974. I'll give a brief overview of some of the key ideas and we'll open it up for discussion. So one of the first things we need to get straight in order to understand what this conflict is about between parents and their offspring is the idea of kin selection and inclusive fitness. And the simplest way is to think about altruistic behaviors, the benefits to the recipient and the cost to the donor, as being changed by the relatedness between the two. So the key here is that the benefit of the altruistic behavior is increased, or rather the cost relative to the benefit is changed as relatedness increases. So the more related that the two are, the more there's reason, evolutionary reason, to perform an altruistic behavior. You can think in terms of 50% of relatedness of parents and their offspring, two parents, each 50%. And the relatedness of offspring to other offspring is being 50%. And then to half siblings is 25%. And you can extend this out to cousins and other related members. In this case, we are thinking about the donor is the parent, the investment that they're giving into their offspring, and the offspring is the recipient. And so the parent-offspring conflict is centered around the fact that each parent is related 50% to each of their offspring. And so their incentive is to give an equilibrium around equal amount of investment to each offspring. Whereas the offspring is also related equally to its other offspring and equally to each of its parents, but its incentive is to try to receive as much investment from its parents as possible. And so there is the conflict where parents are trying to maximize their inclusive fitness by allocating their resources to multiple offspring and in an equal amount. And each offspring is trying to maximize its own reproductive success. So basically, the offspring are trying to demand more resources than the parent is evolutionarily incentivized to give. So there's a few ways to break up that conflict. And this is pulling from Trivers, Parent-Offspring Conflict 1974. The areas are the duration of parental investment. The parents and offspring should disagree over how long the period of parental investment should last. The amount, as well as potentially, we won't go into it more, but even the sex of the offspring, there might be disagreements there. There's some interesting ways that this is sort of actually expressed. So Trivers discusses psychological and behavioral weapons, basically that offspring are trying to employ psychological and behavioral tactics to compete with their parents for resources. You can imagine the baby bird in the nest. And at the same time, this isn't just resource allocation, but is also extending into the very interactions and the psychology of the two. There's an interesting point he makes around socialization, which I thought was really fascinating. Basically, that the process of socialization as the offspring is growing into their world and being taught by the parent how to be, that this is an opportunity, another battleground, if you will, between parents and offspring, where the conflict around inclusive fitness is brought to bear. Basically, one way to think about it is the parents are trying to socialize their offspring to increase their inclusive fitness, which in this case is to allow them to invest equally, perhaps to even encourage their offspring to invest in their siblings, and perhaps to encourage their offspring to invest in the parents as well in altruistic ways. Whereas, of course, the offspring prototypically are being selfishly and egotistical. So you can think about the ways for across different species, including our own, that the development, basically growing up, is is really where this is played out in a lot of ways, although we can talk about it in utero as well. This, at the end of your development, you become a fully fledged adult. And so there too is kind of another way in which the reproductive roles of the offspring, parents may even attempt to mold offspring to be non-reproductive if it serves their inclusive fitness. So this may come up in, especially if a female has multiple male partners. And so now each male partner is only related to the offspring that they've contributed to, whereas the female is related to all of them. So males may try to reduce the reproduction of the other half siblings of their own. So that's perhaps more relevant for other species, although
Not necessarily.
not necessarily, but at least in convention. But certainly we can think of examples, and it's interesting if you flip the sexes as well. So I'll leave it there, and I'll just make maybe one kind of point here, which is, or one kind of area of inquiry, which is that it's interesting for me. I've been thinking about sort of the directionality of this altruism. It really is about parents investing in offspring. And yet, when we just go back to inclusive fitness and thinking about altruistic behavior as being governed by relatedness, and as I mentioned earlier, offspring are related equally to each of their siblings and to each of their parents, that it's interesting to think about the next generation. It's the offspring that is really where the benefit of relatedness comes out, right? Those are the genes that are being passed on. And at the same time, the genes in an offspring are in their parents as well. And so it can still go back to the parents, although it is ultimately about relatedness only matters if it keeps going on across generations. So that is basically an indirect investment into another generation of offspring that offspring might not be even a part of. So we can start with our sort of this traditional frame about parents investing into the next generation and what that means and that conflict. But inclusive fitness is more broad, and you can go back a generation or forward two. It's really all about relatedness. And this is, of course, a 1974 paper. We're thinking from a very gene's eye view. We're thinking entirely about genetic relatedness. But when we think about more social species, we think about various forms of relatedness that have to do with behavior, have to do with culture. There's other ways to extend the conversation and beyond genetic relatedness. What is the fitness of a human if they have no kids but are, culturally dominant, if you will? What does that mean for human fitness in many ways? And so I think, and that doesn't, not limited to humans, but obviously the outlier case. So with that, I will open it up and see if we have any thoughts here. Please raise your hand if we have any takers. Hank.
I only want to say, I just want to thank you for this beautiful, clear, to the point overview. That's all I want to say now.
Great. Rob.
When I was reading this article, I started thinking about parent-child conflict in film, and I came up with the idea of using Rebel Without a Cause as an example of parent-child conflict. And then I started thinking that the title was probably misnamed because there seems to be a cause. But it had to do with the psychology of the parents and the psychology of the son. But I thought it was an interesting example of parent-child conflict. And how do we apply that to the reproductive and kin factors?
Can you say more, Rob, on the psychology piece there for those not familiar?
Well, the father is a weak, psychologically weak, subservient character, and the mother's I think she's an invalid, or she at least pretending to be an invalid, and the father's always doting on her, and and the kid is conflicted because of apparently because of the psychology of the parents. But then I started thinking maybe there's a whole evolutionary dimension to this relationship that the writers of the movie didn't think about. I'd like to make the connection between the kind of parent-child conflict that Trivers is talking about and the kind that we see in cultural artifacts.
Right.
And
yeah, there's two levels. I mean, one is at when we can frame it all in terms of resource investment as like that is what is being given and received. And, psychology and behavior, these are just ways of modulating that, finding ways of basically encouraging more generous behaviors than otherwise would be done. On the other hand, there is, especially when we think about development and the role of psychology as, structuring the whole kind of behavioral personality of an offspring, for instance, into that basically being it does extend to resources, but I think there's something there around like the dynamics or the interactions between how the offspring can almost act as a parent or act in a way that basically they'll receive less, at the like you can think of examples like that. Cool. Yeah, that's Kathleen Hart.
This just fits. I could be continuing your sentence because Rob's idea of bringing in movies is really helpful. So I'm thinking this Japanese movie, I think it was called Narayama in the 1980s, where you have an aging parent. The aging parents, if they're thinking of the clan, will go to this mountainside to die because they know there's not enough resources. But then if you contrast that, let's take a blockbuster like the Titanic, which is not that sort of collectivist mentality that you see in Narayama. And there you have a mother subverting her daughter's mate choice for selfish reasons. The mother wants her to marry this very wealthy man that she's not attracted to. And it's clear that the mother wants the material wealth that the daughter would be bringing in. And so this is an interesting thing where the mate choice of the daughter, on the one hand, she's attracted to someone who has a lot of qualities, but doesn't have money. And then the mother wants her to marry someone very rich. And here's where parent-child conflict, when it comes to humans, is so much more complicated than a matter of genes and statistical payoffs, because this is not a collectivist society. And people, on one hand, you could say that the mother is looking out for her daughter by subverting her daughter's mate choice. But on the other hand, you could say that the daughter is trying to preserve or have better genes. It's just very, the whole, Trivers' model, it works mathematically, but when it comes to human beings, and especially in cultures that have so little to do with the cultural environment that we evolved in, the question of what is selfish and what is altruistic is really turned upside down. I don't know if what I
Yeah,
said
well,
makes.
let's take that example for a moment because I think there's some interesting angles. One is to think about the fact that in this scenario, the daughter is related to the mother 50%, and the mother is related to the daughter 50%. The daughter is going to be related to their offspring 50%. The mother would be related 25. And so that's an interesting piece. So the daughter has the same, both the daughter and the mother would benefit from the material wealth option, right? And at the same time, the mother is more interested in what benefits her and her immediate kin than the next kin. There's an interesting piece here, although I think when you're saying it gets complicated, is like we're talking about material wealth, right? This is something that is more abstract. It requires thinking about these projecting these benefits. And the fact that you said that the daughter is not attracted, well, that is a whole different way of evaluating the potential investment that the grandmother has no bearing on. Attraction is irrelevant to her. And at the same time, what does that signal? That's a much older, ancient signal around the daughter's expectations of a potential mate's investment in the offspring, investments that will benefit her and her offspring directly, because the material wealth is abstract, but a sense of attraction might be a signal of, basically care and investment, commitment, trust, these kinds of things, which from the perspective of a parent is essential. So there's interesting incentives there. I think we could get some insight. But it's kind of like thinking fast and slow as well, material wealth versus biological attraction. And the fact that biological attraction has really no bearing on the mother in that scenario. So even if the incentives in a like a evolutionary model, you can kind of weigh those from the perspective of the actual actors here. Some of them are invisible, basically, and abstract, and certainly the feeling of attraction is probably more compelling to the daughter for evolutionary reasons than her perception of material wealth. And then from there, last point, life history theory, material wealth as being something more valued after you've lived life than when you haven't, especially if haven't had the stress of not having it. So there's all kinds of asymmetries. I like these movies. It seems as if it's a theme.
Yeah.
Any response to that, Kathleen, before we move on?
I was just thinking how Leonardo DiCaprio conveniently dies before she finds out what it's like to be married to a man she's attracted to who's poor after she's
Right.
accustomed.
And how that attraction starts to fade in the face of, basically the signal didn't carry through, perhaps, or maybe it does.
Or he actually saves her life, whereas the fiance, the wicked fiance, did not care to save her life. So
Okay, more signals. Great. Diane.
Well, if we're talking about dramas, seems like one illustration of how property or money distorts these relationships. Everybody should be thinking about Succession, which I didn't really watch all the way through, but I mean, it was definitely about sibling rivalry and manipulations within the family. But I also wanted to come back around to something that you sort of suggested but didn't really follow up on, you meaning Sage. Maybe we need to look at some of the psychological mechanisms that serve these genetic interests. And I wonder whether some of our psychological mechanisms may even go counter to them, because well, looking around this group, half of us are probably my age, which means we're on the verge of being taken care of by our offspring, whereas we took care of them in order to presumably maximize our own genetic payoffs. Now, do they get any payoff out of this? It's dubious, but a lot of people do take care of their elderly parents and relatives. Okay, what kind of mechanism underlies that? And even what are the mechanisms that, psychological mechanisms that underlie caretaking in general, whether it's for our children or for our mates or friends or whatever?
That's interesting, Diane, and it makes me think about I think it's called the grandmother hypothesis or something like that, around basically the
Right.
role of grandparents in a community.
That's very straightforward in terms of the genetic payoff. You take care of your daughter's children. I mean,
Yeah, I think but there's something key there around what is the psychology around caretaking behavior. And I think it feels like the kind of thing that is very prone to cultural differences, as in my intuition around that feels like it's going to be mapped onto weird psychology, one dimension of which is this is Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic, the cultural cluster that represents. One of the dimensions of weird psychology is basically a consistency in our moral behavior. So like weird people are much more concerned with like general kind of absolute rules of moral behavior and really feeling compelled to be consistent with those. Whereas in many other cases, people are much more willing to make exceptions, be particular, have different rules for different relationships. And so there's something, perhaps, my intuition that was at first, the grandmother hypothesis, but then what happens when the grandmother they're not able to care. It's just purely, you're just caring because it's the right thing to do. I mean, what would it be to just suddenly discard one's parents the moment they're not, performing a benefit? What is that? What compels that psychology? This is obviously there's a ultimate causation around that kind of caretaking, but then it does shift, and yet we don't change our behavior somehow right at the point that the cost benefit shifts, right? Like we maintain it.
Right. That was what I was trying to say, but it's not a weird phenomenon. If anything, non-weird societies are much more invested in taking care of their elderly.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'll shut up.
We'll leave that question. What are the psychological mechanisms of caretaking, especially across generations? Rob, you're next.
I think Ken had his hand up before I did.
Okay, sure. Ken.
Okay. Oh boy, a whole list of things here. First of all, thank you for all the movie information. I'm about to see 10 short films from the Manhattan Film Festival tonight, so this is good preparation. But I wanted to say that, there is, just to expand upon what Kathleen and Sage said about this enculturation and how that affects it, there is something that we need to hold this in a larger context. And that larger context is that this paper was written in 1974, and it was in 2010 that Edward O. Wilson, Nowak, and Tarnita told us about how Homo sapiens began to evolve in their groups in a eusocial fashion, that is, individuals adopting different roles in defense of a common nest. Now, that just talks about how it began. Then, of course, it got co-evolved with enculturation. But the thing is that there are two kinds of altruism. There's altruism for the family and altruism for the eusocial group to which we belong. And those often come into conflict. And it occurs to me, I just think of the picture of Abraham with a knife over Isaac. in a story that is trying to convince people that the eusocial group is so important, you should even sacrifice your son for it if necessary. So that's of a concern. That's something that pops in. And also to respond, so there are two kinds of altruism, and they do conflict. And the other one, you talked about, you said that weird people seem to be all about rules. In some of the work I've read by Jonathan Haidt about morality, Western morality seems to be based, morality anyway, seems to be based on injury, on personal injury. If someone gets hurt, it's wrong. Whereas Eastern morality is much more based on violation of cultural norms. And there's a lot of study that's been done on that. There was something else, but I can't remember. I'll probably stick my hand up later.
Yeah, it just to put a finer pin on it, the piece I was talking about is just about moral consistency. The sense that, you know, I have these moral beliefs and these are the moral rules, you know, that I follow, and that I'm very concerned that I follow those across my life. And that one of the big moral problems would be to at any point break those. Like it shouldn't be an exception. If this is a moral rule or value, then that's what it should be. Which turns out to not be at all a universal psychological phenomenon. But again, the context of weird is there's yes, the particular cultural histories, but very much so living in large scale anonymous societies is a huge part of this. So that's often the first kind of principal way of thinking. Why would I need to be worried about being so consistent? Because I'm having a bunch of one-off interactions with folks, and I don't have that chance to have the particular reputation-based relationships that allow us to be more nuanced and understanding about where the context. And your point about Jonathan Haidt is interesting too. Hank, your hand keeps disappearing. Oh yeah, okay. Let's go to Hank and then Russ.
Oh, okay. Ooh, this is it's quite satisfying and beautifully complex and never ending. But let me go to let me see. I think I just want to say something from reading this stuff and looking at it really for the first time. And I've seen the video and looked up some more material. But I tend to, since my work as a psychotherapist in different realms, I kind of go back there at some point, if not right away. So it sort of opened up my eyes about human behavior, reading this stuff on the genetic level and fitness. But I was thinking about these two concepts that I work with people. That this stuff. Well, one more thing before that. So I'm thinking about the next is competition of resources and sharing of resources based on what we've been reading, what we've been discussing on, from Trivers and everybody's comments here. So that's the other. And then I think about when I work with mostly individuals, we talk about self-remembering and self-forgetting as a way of dealing with the competition or sharing of resources. So I think about with people, and I've learned this from my clients. So, I mean, I'm coining it, but they've coined it for me over the years. But self-forgetting is a little something to do with the proclivity towards emptying oneself of need or sacrifice or whatever Judeo-Christian Islam cultural motif about sacrifice, but in the Christian notion of emptying oneself and then allowing nourishment coming in from whether it's Christ or the universe. And then there's self-remembering, which requires filling yourself up with something and where are the resources you get it from. And this becomes, this paradox is an area that people struggle with all the time, at least the way one of the threads that I work with. So I just want to let people know that's what it's activating in me, as well as these other communications that are coming up. I think.
Thanks, Hank. I think that's for me touches on there's a certain Machiavellian portrayal of organisms, what it thinks about, trying to maximize, the benefit, the investment from others. When of course, there may be a whole psychological experience around, just awareness of the fact that you are actually taking, and what does that mean to take, so that I can know when to give, and that, keeping these things in mind, and tracking, are others tracking this? So, yeah,
Mhm.
like it depends on the species and the context, of course, but
Right.
it's not just humans that are tracking basically the cooperative behaviors of others and
Right.
knowing who is, yeah. And the idea that there wouldn't be some sense of, yeah, so some negative feedback basically around like taking too much, and
Mhm.
how does one experience
Yeah.
moderation?
Well, one thing it opened up for me is in reading and us talking is I started thinking about, I have one sibling, about 3 years younger, and I was thinking of my sister and I in the nest, and my parents, the two birds. And I have a feeling, I didn't think about it, but I think I was the stronger bird. I got more nourishment from whatever my parents had to offer, which had its complications. And my poor sister, I feel even more badly for her now that she didn't know how to get it. I mean, she's okay, but I think I didn't know why I felt so guilty all my life about my success. So one of them was my poor sister. She didn't, I mean, I didn't challenge her. I didn't want to get more than another. I just, genetically was the bird with, open the mouth up or something. So,
Yeah, especially in childhood development, you get those kinds of feedbacks. Uh, Very interesting. Russ.
Thanks, Sage. I'd like to, I think, build on what Ken discussed in a way that I hope doesn't sound too going to an extreme. But I really question why we should adopt a Trivers perspective on family conflict, parent-child conflict. If we adopted a Trivers perspective generally in evolutionary theory, I think we could shut down the whole pro-social approach as we understand it. Because, of course, the notion of kin selection and its companion of reciprocity as the basis of altruistic behavior was really proposed as a way of explaining what appears to be altruistic behavior is not really altruistic. It's really self-interested behavior that, whether you understand it as selfish genes exerting their control, or simply the larger organism acting in its own self-interest, it's really not, parents caring for children or people doing favors for others. It's really just all basically self-interested behavior. And so I wonder why we can't pose the question, which I think Ken has already done, but of whether there are in fact functional advantages for family units and for communities of maintaining cooperative relations within family units, and obviously all kinds of bases of potential conflicts, but not assuming that there is some underlying fundamental drive to compete in destructive ways, and then in fact the unit as a whole will benefit, and including in terms of reproductive success over time, from a functional unit. And as Ken pointed out, and others have now said, alloparenting is, hunter-gatherer societies. And it's the opposite of the Trivers perspective on this. And the reason that it exists, I think, without being an anthropologist, I'm on thin ice. I realize I'm a sociologist with all those limitations. But the reason that it exists is because it does improve reproductive success, and from kind of in the context of group selection and community benefit, as well as healthy parenting and in enduring relationships, and it's certainly about grandparents, but it's even broader than that.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of feeling like let's not get too hung up on Robert Trivers, who I think, again, has got a lot wrong about evolutionary theory that has, as Ken pointed out, really been, rather criticized by, I think, people like us.
Well, that's
We're in a different place in terms of thinking about evolution.
Yeah, well, thanks, Russ. It's the elephant in the room, and also, I think where there's two versions. One, we just look at the Trivers at the time, and yes, it is all of what you said is valid. But if we do an updated version, I think we can still salvage the value and what it requires, and everything you're saying is an expanded view of what relatedness means. So there's a few angles to that. One is to think about genes as existing in a community of other genes, and that basically the fitness of any genes is in that community. And so the relatedness alone is not enough. It's relatedness within that niche, that context of this community. And I think that's what underpins social and eusocial organisms, alloparenting. Your parenting is not just dependent on your own ability. Your success is dependent on the availability of others to help. And then, of course, when we think about cultural species like ourselves, then you can think about cultural relatedness. And so then with that, whole behavioral and psychological mechanisms are actually altruistic from a gene's eye perspective, but from the perspective of like an expanded version of relatedness, then there's still the sense of like, I'm going to help those who are going to help me. I'm going to help those who are related to me in other ways basically through our social ties, through our culture, through our, the equilibrium of our genes in this community. But I'm still not going to do that for everyone, right? There are still the idea of like, who should I be investing in? It's still not it's right in there in pro-social processes, in Eleanor Ostrom. You still have to draw the bounds of identity based on, in that case, shared purpose, but in this case, shared relatedness. You will lose out if you were just investing in everyone. But you don't it definitely Trivers and the genes I view is wrong to say, oh, you can only invest in those you're genetically related to, ignoring all other context, social structures, and cultural systems of learning, and alloparenting and all of that. The sociology of genes, I think, is really essential. Otherwise, so it's naive at this point, Trivers, but it is helpful to look at it just to understand the modulation of cost benefit in relatedness. But yeah, we need a new model that takes account a lot more interactions. How does that sit with you, Russ, before we move on?
I think I said enough. Going.
Well, no, I'm glad you did say it, and it gives us a chance to
frankly, my quick reaction is once you leave the context of genetic relatedness, the whole Trivers approach starts to break down.
Yeah.
The issue of in-group and out-group cohesion, so on, is really in a different ballpark, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's an important point of not trying to basically reinterpret everything that it has ignored what has happened in the last 50 years because it came before it, and instead there are certainly better theories for all of this. That being said, as a basic concept, it's helping us, and there's something about there's always something comforting about just falling back into a gene's eye view, and then it helps you think about these things. But of course, you go too far down that path, you start to think of everything in terms of a very reductionist view, and you can't comprehend reality anymore. So let's go to Rob.
Okay, I am trying to reconstruct all the rooms in my memory palace from the things that I've been thinking about as this conversation is going on, and I can think of maybe two or three. One had to do with the Titanic reference that Kathleen brought up. It seems to me that there is something to be said for the mother's investment in the daughter's happiness is particularly related to sexual attraction in order to increase the fitness of her grandchildren. Money seems to me very much a sort of Henry James 19th century good marriage model of the universe, which was my mother's model. And I think that there's a more subtle investment in the way children can thrive, and probably invest more in their offspring if they're both happy and having sex with somebody they really like. But I just set that aside. That's one thought. The other had to do with Abraham raising his knife over Isaac, and a story I find particularly horrific. I don't understand how this benefits the in-group, or whether it benefits the in-group at all, because it's not incited by the in-group. It's incited by the magic elf. I don't know. So then I was thinking about something that was said recently, and I think I've forgotten that. So, yeah, Diane brought up a year or two ago Christopher Boehm and Hierarchy in the Forest, a book I found really formative in terms of the development of cooperation in small groups. And I think it's very important to remember that they're not necessarily related. That's not a biological connection. So the hunter-gatherer bands were probably formed by exchanging members with other groups as you wander around, and a coalition of both kin and non-kin. And I'm not sure that the kinship model, I don't think that people think about how they're relating to their kin's benefit by having sex with other people. I think they're thinking about pleasure. And I think that's designed on purpose to make us spread it around. So that's it.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, today is an exercise of like, it's easier to think about what is right, and it's a better way of thinking by looking at something that is perhaps outdated. we can find the value in newer ideas, and that's just a flag that Christopher Boehm and reverse dominance, basically the group as being the most dominant, so that any strong individual can't just basically lead by dominance alone, leading to prestige and reputation-based kinds of social interactions. So all of this, and again, yes, not necessarily about relatedness. This is all about updating into complexity, into thinking about things as happening in the context of other things. And so, yes, altruistic behavior in the context of a group of people who might throw rocks at you if you don't, or if you do something nasty, is a very different thing than altruistic behavior in an atomized, individualist, relatedness-based calculation, which probably never existed for humans because we're a social species. So, that being said, there are more species than humans, and they are not all social. Go to I see Kathleen Hart and Ken, but let's go to Cesar. We haven't heard from you. Cesar?
Yes, thank you. For me, there are at least 3 different kinds of conflicts that influence the way that we analyze. The first one is, I think there are conflicts among parents and offsprings when you think in the family as an entity. So it's very important to have this, for instance, when you have synergy or trust, so you're not calculating things for but as a tradition. So we know that it is the way that you can handle complexities of the world, since you can leave your arms or your guards out here inside family. So this the maintenance of the synergy of the family is something that usually the parents try to keep, but the kids, they live in a new world. They see the evolution, so they try to change things. They bring this innovation to inside the family. I think this brings some kind of conflicts, and this is one kind of conflicts inside families. The other one that I think is another nature is that there are some incoherence. For instance, when you think about moral development, the way that people behave in society, we know that there are these levels of more selfish people and more common good oriented people. But when you are inside the family, we want all of them to behave as thinking about the family, so taking into account the others. But if you behave outside the family as a selfish, for instance, if you have a family of thieves, that's a good example. So what would happen? You say outside it's allowed to be selfish, to be opportunist, but inside the family you must be other. And so this is another kind of conflicts. And the third one, I think, is a natural one. That's when you are growing up, you are preparing to have your own family. So we have finite resources, time, attention. So it's common to want all the time and the attention that you used to have. But the kids, they go out and they are preparing for a new family. This is a natural conflict, but it's hard to navigate this kind of conflicts. And I would say that when we talk about complexity, for instance, the best example to say how to tackle, how to understand complexity is to analyze how we raise children, because what we do now, for instance, with one child may work this moment, but 1 year, 2 years later, you must change the way you relate to your kids, because he has new experience, the world is changing, and if you have another child, you must handle completely different. So this don't giving up of trying different things is kind of a preparation for the complexity in the world. So we learn how to navigate this complexity inside the families, but it is all the time based on conflicts, on natural conflicts. So I think that if you don't bring this more comprehensive analysis, it's poorer than just making the payoff calculations. So
Yeah, thank you, Cesar, for bringing in all of that rich context and the where this takes place, especially inside and outside family, and then over time, how things change. I really like that idea of the conflict of the child's incentive to learn where the world is now and to try to change their environment, whereas the parents are trying to basically keep it consistent, perhaps to even try to have more of a conservative approach in the tradition sense of like, I just need to make do what works. I'm not trying to change anything, especially if they're already on a second or third kid, right? Well, lots of great ideas there. I'll just leave that for anyone else to respond to. Coming up in our last 5 minutes, so let's any final thoughts here, but Kathleen and then Ken.
Hi, Cesar, thank you for pushing us beyond the family. And I just want
were you referring to me or to Kathleen Hart? Because my hand's been raised for a while.
Oh, I didn't realize your hand was up, Kathleen, or I would have asked that too.
I saw it up, Kathleen, and go for it.
Well, I just want to say that I wasn't going to speak because I haven't read the preparation materials, but I do have 2 degrees in psychology, and I've read a lot of old psychology papers having to do with family dynamics. And I just finished Joseph Heinrich's The Secret of Our Success, which really emphasizes the prevalence or the dominance of cumulative cultural evolution over genetic evolution in terms of what is driving human society today. And, one way of looking at that is that cumulative cultural evolution provides information that individuals, families, and children, for example, in a single family, with the information that they need to survive, which is a lot more complex than just food or shelter. And families exist within groups. So he always emphasizes the importance of groups. And I liked what I think it was Russell said earlier about allo-parenting. I think allo-parenting exists today, not in a hunter-gatherer way, but parenting is shared by teachers, by caregivers, etc. And the value of cultural learning is pretty significant. And just going back to the example of the Titanic, the mother, maybe coming from a Victorian perspective, wanted the best for her daughter, so her daughter would maintain social standing, and she would be in a group that could provide her and her children with the education and the social mores, the information that they would need to truly survive. Where handsome, sexy, Leonardo DiCaprio, that would fade, and perhaps the children wouldn't thrive in circumstances where they didn't have access to the kind of social and cultural information they needed to really be successful. So I just wanted to emphasize how powerful and exciting I found his work. And I'm also reading David Sampson's Our Tribal Future, which also emphasizes the importance of nested groups. The family only exists within a larger group. And I think there are other evolutionary needs aside from just replication of genes.
Thanks, Kathleen. And that's really great. Let me draw a connection to what Cesar said. The positionality of the mother, the culture that she's interested in is different than the daughter. She's probably not as interested in that. And another point from Joe Henrich is how selective children are of who they learn from. No one needs to tell children to pay attention to the person they pay attention to. They don't pay attention to the person they think is not relevant. And how do they make those decisions? And how does that change over time? It's really interesting to think about the priorities of our cultural inheritance as they change over time. That's great. And let's bringing the material back into the biological as well. So Ken, you want to take us out?
I just want to ask a quick question. At one point, Trivers asserts that, when an offspring doesn't get as much investment as he wants, one of the tactics that he can use is to revert to the behavior of a younger offspring because mother is more likely to. And he describes that as, he said, we call it now in psychiatry, we call it regression. And I wondered, I know that there are a number of psychotherapists here, and I wondered if you felt that that was an appropriate or sufficient definition for regression.
That to Hank, if he wants to make a quick response. Hank, you're muted.
Muted, Hank. You're muted, Hank.
I'm not clear of the question, so it's going to take too much time to rephrase it. But I got the gist is not enough for me to respond to.
Okay, that's okay. Good.
Okay, I can say one thing. There are many ways to seek out the unavailable resources or the wished for resources in a family unit. And acting out or negative behavior is just one common one. I mean, it's just, there it is, you know. It could be the great, but yeah, okay.
Well, to leave us with an example from media of, if any of you have seen the show Arrested Development, which and the behavior of the character Buster is basically that of permanent infant child. So yep. to the doting mother. And there's many more examples. Well, it seems like we might need to bring in some more arts and culture to our discussions, because they seem to be unknowingly tying in perfectly. That's a thought of itself. We're going to vote again on the Hilo group, in particular, because we need some more suggestions. I'll make a couple, but I'll make a post, and please share and, just comment, give a reaction to the ones you like. We'll kind of summarize it up, and we're going to do in 3 weeks, October 19th will be our next session. So you can mark it in your calendars, and I'll share the usual invite and everything. Thanks, everybody. That was a wonderful conversation. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sage.
Thanks, everybody.